never thought I'd see the day when I found an airplane that could outperform my favorite warbird, the F-15, and I definitely did not expect that it was going to be British. Today we're going to talk about the first and last all-British supersonic aircraft and the incarnation of hell on wings, the English Electric Lightning. This absolute ugly duckling is one of the highest performing hot rods of the muscle plane era and the aircraft that defined the word supercruise for the entire planet. And for all its royal magnificence, this plane also became the embodiment of how badly politics can screw up a perfectly good airplane right from the very beginning, because thanks to the standard World War II age British bollockry, the RAF was about 10 years behind the rest of the world technologically. The story of this level of impotence started all the way back in 1942. While the Japanese are pulling an Admiral Akbar at Midway, it's a trap! The British had started on a project called the Miles M52 because the air was being a pain in the tea bags. See, right around this time, the UK had started really discovering how compressibility works, that being air forming shockwaves in front of flight surfaces and turning controls into paperweights when they get too excited during a mid-flight invitation to the ground, better known as a power dive. Since planes are supposed to air bend through the air stream and not earth bend through the Earth's crust, the Brits decided it would be smart to take a vested interest in understanding how to put the wind in a chokehold because, well, they were in the middle of a war and it was kind of important to make sure their pilots weren't looking at the ground and saying, "Take that, you rock!" But because they were in the middle of getting bombed and needed a lot of resources focused on important things like not getting invaded, a supersonic jet wasn't really all that high on the priorities list, and by the end of the war, the project hadn't gotten very far. Then the political cherry was laid out on top when the post-war British government elected majority control to the Labour Party in 1945. This political party wanted to allocate resources away from military projects to prevent another Great Depression like the one that had come after World War I, and decided to steal the gas tanks off a number of projects, including the Miles M52. Many of the officials in the government doubted the practicality and need for supersonic aircraft at the time and decided to officially shelve the project in February of 1946 under the rationales of it being A, too expensive, and B, unsafe for the pilot. The latter of those reasons especially was, well, to borrow some British vernacular, absolute rubbish, because the project's data would eventually find its way to Bell and be used for the American X-1, which broke the sound barrier 6 months later. And once the US had taken first place, as we the people of the United States of America have come to expect of our red, white, and blue blood, the Brits decided to try for their piece of the international credit and declassify the M52 project in September of that same year. The British straight up saw the little brother getting all the credit and decided to steal some of the spotlight, and literally the entire planet looked over at the Labour government and said, "Shut up, because the people of the UK were steaming. And I get it. I mean, if I was alive back in 1969 and the US government had come out and told me that the Soviets put man on the moon first because we had decided 6 months ago that going to the moon was too expensive and wasn't safe despite investing all of my tax dollars into it for several years, I'd want to punch my local congressperson too. We were in the lead and you betrayed us. I hate you. But one person didn't give up on the idea of giving Britain a supersonic plane. English Electric's William Edward Willoughby Petter, aka Teddy. Teddy was known for designing fast aircraft, and he was responsible for designing the Canberra jet bomber. So in 1947, the British Labour government granted him funding to pull out the nutcracker on the science case of figuring out supersonic airplanes. So even though the government had just said supersonics were unsafe, English Electric decided it was time to prove them wrong, and they got to work on a research test bed called the P1. The P1 had a flattened circular open nose intake, 60 degrees swept wings, and a low-set all-moving horizontal tail combined with two Armstrong Siddeley Sapphire jet engines. The wing was swept really hard back for the time because they needed the high speed, and the low-set tail meant that even at high angles of attack, the tail would still be fully responsive in the airstream and wouldn't be blocked by flow separation or airflow just losing its mind after coming off the wing at that angle, allowing the tail to respond to a stable airstream regardless. But it was the two engines that were stacked vertically that would be the most defining feature of the jet. Teddy decided he wanted to have his supersonic jet look like an aerodynamic Jenga tower because a massive chunk of drag force in flight comes from the frontal profile of the airplane. If you stick both engines side by side, then you'd have 2 engines worth of frontal area slowing you down, not including the rest of the airframe. But Teddy realized that every airplane out there already has something that protrudes vertically, the canopy. Realizing that no matter how he designed the aircraft, it was always going to be just the cockpit bulging up out of the fuselage and the plane wouldn't be just glad to see him, he decided to leverage the natural girth of an airframe and stack one of the engines behind the cockpit to cut down on cross-section. The result result was a plane with twice the thrust of a single-engine airplane and only 1.5 times the frontal area. It's actually perfect.
You're either perfect or you're not me. There's no gray area.
However, classic British politics and the Labour government would yet again step in and cause issues, insisting they knew best and trying to micromanage the project. They, in their infinite wisdom, decided they knew better than an actual aerospace engineering corporation and decided that Petter's configuration was too radical and needed further investigation. After arguing back and forth for several years, in 1949, Teddy Petter quit the project entirely, and the following year, the Labour government would contract Short to create a whole new airplane just to test the configuration for the other test airplane. Just makes perfect sense. Thankfully, the Labour government was officially replaced in 1951, and the year after that, the Short SB-5 would take to the skies. It would finally prove once and for all that Petter was right the whole damn time, and everyone could finally witness the sheer depth to which the Labour government had their heads shoved up their rears, thereby explaining how their rears never got jealous of the shit that came out of their mouths. Despite the full-tilt political interference, Double E did actually learn a few things. First of those being the airflow over the steeply swept wings would create a vortex that messed with the aileron controls and made them inconsistent. The workers' fraternity over there recommended adding wing fences, but English Electric wasn't having any of that because that would create more drag, which would stop them from trying to race God. Instead, they did something that seems really counterintuitive at first. They cut holes in the front of the wings, creating something called a pressure fence. These leading-edge slots would both disrupt the vortices over the wings and allow air to be taken in by the fuel tank intake valves placed behind them to neutralize tank pressure. 2 birds, 1 stone, easy money, and they worked so well they kept the feature on the production aircraft for the rest of forever. But what didn't work well were the P-1 Sapphire engines, which were too weak and had to be held down at 100% to do literally everything. Taking off 100%, holding altitude 100%, landing probably somewhere about 100%, and holding the throttle all the way down isn't great for fuel economy, which isn't great for flight range, and you might not need a lot of that, but you're gonna need some, and constant balls to the wall won't get you much. Not to mention, it just wasn't thrusty enough in the first place, so off it went, and in came the Rolls-Royce Avon 201 engines, pumping out between 13,000 and 14,000 pounds of dry thrust each. These engines were so powerful that during taxi tests, they had to keep one engine at half power and keep pumping the brakes just to stop the aircraft from running away from them.
Why are you running?
Double E started integrating these changes into an updated prototype that could be optimized for production, called the P-1B, using the old anti-government trick of calling a new plane the same thing to secure government funding because politicians don't actually know what they're talking about most of the time. They added a shock cone to the now circular intake and stuck a radar underneath it, then gave it a dad bod with a 250-gallon fuel tank. Then they gave the wing a fetish, a kink. This slight change in the sweep angle at the front of the wing would shake up the airflow and add to the effect of the pressure fence, but it wouldn't actually be produced until much later when they were sure it worked. The P-1B finally got air on April 4th, 1957, at which point it immediately kissed the sound barrier goodbye without even using the afterburners because those things just didn't work. And this actually made the new P-1B the first aircraft to ever be capable of what would eventually be known as supercruise. Hats off to the Brits for that jolly good show. But the sprint of good luck didn't last long, and by didn't last long, I mean it ended the exact same day, because the new Minister of Defense, Duncan Sandys, would publish his 1957 Defense White Paper, which ordered the UK to stop making super cool things like fighter jets and interceptors and start making lame, spicy things like nuclear missiles for strategic defense of the island.
Ugh, no one cares.
Thankfully, somebody who presumably wasn't spoiled at birth had the foresight to understand that point defense interceptors were still needed and stepped in to let the program keep going under the condition the Lightning be specified for the interceptor role. Double E did try to go for exports, but once again, politics got in the way when a government official straight up sabotaged the possibility by telling the German Luftwaffe not to buy them. Like, I genuinely have to take my hat off to the Brits for lasting long enough for the US to come in and save them in the Second World War with the sheer volume of stubborn, bullheaded horse crap in their political leadership they've had to put up with.
How the blood-soaked Protestant hell did you do that? You, that's how.
Despite the British government's stubbornness, however, they did understand they needed the plane, because 2 experiences had made it clear they were ill-prepared for an intercept scenario against enemy nuclear bombers. First of all, in the Korean War, Royal Australian Air Force Gloucester Meteors would hold hands with the Americans and panic when the MiG-15s showed up, which were, ironically, powered by Rolls-Royce engines the company had given up to the Soviets after losing a game of pool. Finally came full circle on them, and to make it worse, during Exercise Ardent in 19 M52, the US and UK teamed up to test their ability to intercept incoming bombers, where the Brits discovered that those same meteors couldn't even catch their own Canberra bombers unless they were flying at less than half their maximum service ceiling. I'm trying to tell you that they were rudely awakened to the realization that if somebody wanted the British bombed, the next museum they were gonna build would be called the Imperial Crater Museum. And with new Soviet bombers on the horizon like the supersonic booze carrier, that was motivation enough to get a new plane up and running. Consequently, they took the P-1B prototype and shoved it straight into production as the English Electric Lightning F1 in the spring of 1960, right as English Electric merged with Vickers and Bristol to create the British Aircraft Corporation, or BAC. And when I say they shoved it into production, I'm not even making a metaphor. They literally just changed the tail, strapped on a ventral fin, and threw it onto the assembly line.
Corporate needs you to find the differences between this picture and this picture.
This meant the plane was never fully converted into a serviceable platform, and they were basically trying to mass-produce prototypes. Pause. That's a huge issue, because in mass production, designs have to be reworked slightly to allow them to be manufactured by machinery and people with less training instead of engineers, so things have to be made with more available or easier to machine parts than the custom hardware the engineers put together in their testing labs. You gotta make it partial stupid-proof. With a prototype, and especially a technology demonstrator like the Lightning was originally supposed to be, you don't have this included, because you're more focused on making sure that the core concepts that make the plane an improvement actually work. This meant that spare parts in planes were both rare and expensive, and maintenance could take forever to finish, especially if a Lightning had a major issue and stopped being airworthy. Some Lightning pilots noted that functional platforms were often few in number, and when they did pass out from being overworked like a video gamer in a bar, which wasn't much, they would stay out exponentially longer than anything else on the planet.
So we agreed she broke it.
Oh, yes.
Placement of the engines didn't help, considering that with the engines stacked in different positions for center of mass reasons, one had to be lifted out of the top while the other was lowered out of the bottom, requiring two different kinds of equipment to service them and twice the certifications for the ground crews. The positioning also made fires a concern in the event of fuel leaking from the upper engine, which it already had so little of to begin with that they needed an in-flight refueling probe attached on the F-1A version's left wing. The creation of that was its own little nightmare story, because the design department tried to get it done in so much of a hurry they didn't coordinate with the test pilots, you know, the people who actually know what everyone else is going to have to deal with. They had originally designed the probe really short in order to make it stable and sturdy, but what would end up happening was you'd have to guide the fuel drogue in while looking over your shoulder, while also trying to look at the refueler to make sure you were matching speed and position with it, which was basically impossible if you're not a frickin' chameleon.
Do you have 3 eyes?
Sweetheart, I've got so many eyes. Eyes for days.
Eyes for days?
Eyes for days.
Luckily, the chief test pilot, Roland Baymont, wasn't having any of it and basically held the engineers down by the throat until they extended it so the pilot could actually see the probe and the guiding aircraft at the same time. But because of the extension, it was so structurally thin by comparison that any sudden movement during refueling could rip the tip of the probe right off. And speaking of visibility, another issue was that you had to stick your head into a rubber funnel if you wanted to see the radar scope. So if you were looking at the radar, you weren't looking at anything else that might be important, like, I don't know, other planes or the ground. Making the plane feel even more like a skeleton prototype was the fact that it was designed around the ability to carry missiles, but the missile came before the countermeasures, so the Lightning never had any of them installed or a radar warning system for its entire service life. But the British Lightning wasn't just a living framework. It was also a blistering firecracker of an aircraft with enough milestones to pave a driveway. It was the first British aircraft to reach both Mach 1 and Mach 2 in level flight, and the first fighter jet in the world to ever have a hands-on throttle and stick, or HOTAS, control setup, which is a control design meant to allow pilots to hit most of their required buttons without taking their hands off the controls in a fight. Thanks to the obscene thrust output of 36,000 pounds total with afterburner, this made it also likely the first production aircraft in history to have a thrust-to-weight ratio greater than 1, which would allow the plane to break the sound barrier in a vertical climb from 10,000 feet to 60,000 feet in less than 60 seconds and supercruise up to Mach 1.2. Another Lightning pilot, Sir Ivor Broom, timed his climb from the runway to 30,000 feet in full afterburner. It took him a minute and a half. These things were so fast that the only area it probably disappointed came from the pilot's spouses. Test pilot John Howe from 74th Squadron, the first unit to receive the Lightnings, was asked about how he felt with his first flight in the aircraft, to which he responded, "Super, I was with it all the way until I let the brakes off." Most pilots would usually go supersonic in a climb in their first flight because it accelerated so fast that pilots would usually have trouble getting the nose gear retracted on takeoff. Since it folded forward, the increased force of air resistance as you sped up would try and force it down, meaning that you would have to retract it before you hit 290 miles an hour on takeoff. Back when Double E was still trying to export this thing, one of the German pilots came over to test fly it and took off in afterburner despite being recommended otherwise, and he didn't get the nose gear folded up until he was at 28,000 feet. And while that was using 2 engines, even flying half-mast could get the Lightning supersonic or keep it stable at 40,000 feet. And to give you some perspective on how ridiculous that is, in training, no other pilot could catch them, not even the comparable F-104 Starfighter. My experience with the Starfighter's climbing performance is restricted to War Thunder, so historical mileage may vary, but if you started about 700 miles an hour, basically Mach 1 at roughly 5,000 feet, and pitch the nose up to 45 degrees, by the time you hit 30,000 feet in a few minutes, you will be flying at roughly 330-ish miles an hour, which is a sitting duck in the era of muscle planes. At that speed and altitude, the Starfighter can't maneuver to save its life, and the Lightnings could go even higher to where it could intercept the U-2 spy planes routinely at nearly 66,000 feet. American pilots were actually getting jealous of the Lightning, which probably marks the only time in history since 1776 where Americans actually wanted what the British were selling.
Okay, I know it's filthy rich coming from me, but your powers are bullshit!
The F2 model brought a nice quality of life step forward with things like fully adjustable afterburners, a steerable nose wheel, and an autopilot, but almost immediately after, they would take 2 steps back with the F3 when the British made the classic 1960s-era mistake of thinking that missiles were going to be the end-all be-all and remove the twin 30mm Aiden cannons from their place on the nose. These were replaced with twin fuselage-mounted Firestreak heat-seeking missiles, which, as we mentioned before, had the ability to be installed as early as the P-1B prototypes. The only reason they were being relied on now was that it took them up to the F3 model to figure out how to fully integrate the targeting sensors. This model also replaced the early Ferranti AI-23 airborne intercept radar with a Doppler radar to better find targets, and the intention of this version was to fully actualize the idea of a, quote, modern interceptor, which probably would have worked out okay if the tools of the trade weren't total trash. First of all, the early missiles the plane was made for just weren't cutting it. The Firestreak missiles were too slow and short range, and they were also useless against turning adversaries because of a maximum sustainable overload of about 7 Gs, whereas most fighters can crank about 9. They were also made of some really dangerous chemicals, which made them, kind of unpopular with the ground crews. These were later replaced with the Red Top missiles that had better speed and range than the Firestreaks and even the AIM-9 Sidewinders. But if it was sent to track the broadside of a barn in anything other than clear sunny weather, I'd be putting my money on the barn.
Wow, you really do shoot like a stormtrooper.
The other issue that the Lightning still had was the flight range. The maximum range you could get out of this virtually non-existent fuel storage was about 800 miles under the most perfect of conditions, but pilots could very easily run out of gas in about 10 to 15 minutes. Normally you would have fuel stored in the wings, but there wasn't any room there because that's where the landing gear were, and the Lightning needed them there because it stabilized the plane against the 200-mile-an-hour landing speeds caused by the 60-degree swept wing. The flight range would remain an issue all the way up until the F6 model. There would be 4 and 5 variants, but those were trainer versions of the F3. The F6, meanwhile, was the ultimate Lightning. Thanks to the pilots' complaints, they got the twin cannons back, and the beer gut was increased to 610 gallons of gas. The wings finally got internal tanks, and they figured out how to add external tanks by mounting them over the wings. BAC made the tail longer and squared off the top, and finally built in the fetish wing, and the fuel changes increased the range of the aircraft by about 20%, finally giving it some decent legs.
I'm going traveling.
This version was also finally considered acceptable for export, and they managed to finally sell some T5s with F6 modifications to Saudi Arabia and Kuwait. Kuwait basically never flew the 12 they bought because their maintenance standards were absolute garbage, but the Saudis loved their 40 Lightnings for close air support using rocket pods and bombs. But back on the British front, they would start moving past the Lightnings in 1966 when they ordered their own versions of the battle-tested F4 Phantoms with better radars. Pilots hated the Phantoms that the UK bought because they didn't have guns or gun pods installed by this point in time, and the Lightning F3 had made it very clear how they felt about that particular state. But before their beloved plane fully retired in 1988, it would rack up its fair share of stories to tell.
What do you mean by stories? Are we talking the kinds you brag about at the bar, or the ones you don't want your boss to know about?
Thank you so much for asking, Crumb. For example, the same year the UK bought the Phantoms, a mechanic named Terry Holden of the 33rd Maintenance Unit was trying to resolve the case of a Lightning F2's dashboard not responding when the afterburner was lit. A test pilot wasn't going to be around for a bit, and he probably wanted to go have a skinful at the bar that evening, so he decided to get in the plane and figure it out himself. He starts up the engines to check on them and starts mucking about the cockpit, and he accidentally hits the switch to kick on the afterburners. The 36,000 pounds of thrust on this plane immediately gets the beast rolling. He starts panicking a bit because he can't figure out how to shut it off. He starts getting up to where the runway is, and he's debating whether he should just go for a takeoff run or try and pull in the landing gear on the ground and just crash it. But right as he turns onto the runway, he looks up and he sees a de Havilland Comet carrying RAF command staff on the opposite end of the runway beginning their own takeoff roll. Holden is now head-to-head with this much slower airplane that will probably need more runway to take off, and there's no guarantee that if he crashes this Lightning that the Comet's going to be able to get up in time. So he chooses to take off and floors it. His base commander, Frederick Hazelwood, watches in a panic from the air traffic control towers. He loops around the pattern and lines up his landing pass. As it turns out, Holden actually had some flying experience in light aircraft, and because he was a mechanic, he knew the cockpit controls really well, and somewhere in the flight, he managed to shut off the afterburners before bringing the plane in for a smooth landing and a perfect stop. When Holden finally got out of the plane, he sees Hazelwood and immediately apologizes for his screw-up and taking off in a Lightning without permission. Like, this is probably a court-martial, and he knows it. But Hazelwood just looks at Holden and says, actually, you know what? I'm gonna let him tell this part of the story.
Had he had a hat on, I'm sure he would have saluted. And I was first up, and he said, "I'm terribly sorry, sir." I said, "Taff," I said, "I'm not at all. I've still got his original 765C, which sort of says 5 minutes solo in the Lightning, you see, which it was."
This Lightning would later be sent to the Imperial War Museum in Duxford, but others would still set the Lightning's tales in stone. Like the story of how the Lightning got its only kill in its whole service life with the British against a Harrier. In the 1970s, a Harrier jump jet had some kind of malfunction and the pilot ejected, but the plane stayed aloft and began drifting towards Germany and the Soviet Union. This was the most functional jump jet in the world, and they couldn't have that tech in Soviet hands, so they scrambled some Lightnings and shot it down. Or the time when it actually beat the F-15 in a performance contest in April 1985. The countries of the Western world were invited to bring their fastest aircraft together all in one place to try and catch the Concorde passenger jetliner, which could supercruise at Mach 2. They brought everything they had to bear, including F-15s, F-16s, F-14s, even F-104s and Mirages. And out of all these planes, the only ones who could keep catching the high-flying Concorde time after time were the Lightnings.
Well.
The Lightning was only supposed to serve for 8 years, but it wasn't until 40 years after its requirement had first been come up with that it was actually retired, despite not receiving any major modernization efforts. The 337 units that were produced provided the UK with an important milestone in their aviation journey, and the last one of their pure own. But arguably the biggest contributions it left behind on British military policy were with maintaining readied response forces and the associated logistics of a Quick Reaction Alert, or QRA, fighter force, where you had to go from zero to ballroom floor in about 10 minutes. But it also left a mark on the entire world. The HOTAS control setup, the shoulder-mounted supersonic swept wing, and the all-moving low-set horizontal tail would set the standard for nearly, if not every, fighter, trainer, and high-performance aircraft of the 4th generation ever made. So in summation, if you ever go visit an air show and see one of these still flying, just remember that if it shows off what it's capable of, you will see the lightning before you hear the thunder. Thank you to MrFullCrumb for the cameo, and thank you for watching. If you like what you saw, please consider checking out some of my other videos. You might like what you find. Until next time, dismissed.